In the autumn of 1936, in a quiet stretch of farmland in western Minnesota, a 10-year-old girl spent 6 straight weeks digging holes in frozen dirt. She wasn't building anything anyone could see the point of. She wasn't fixing the barn roof, which sagged a little more every winter. She wasn't helping mend the fence line, which her grandfather said was held together by prayer and rust. She was planting trees, rows of them, small, spindly pine seedlings, barely taller than her knee, set in careful lines around the old family barn. Her name was Clara Voss, and by the time she was done, she'd planted over 200 of them. The neighbors laughed. The older farmers, the ones who'd worked that valley since before the First War, shook their heads and muttered about wasted seasons. "Pretty little decoration," one of them said, leaning on the fence post to watch her work. "Won't do a thing for your corn." Clara didn't answer him. She just kept digging. Nobody in Ashwood Valley knew it yet, but a winter was coming that none of them would forget, and by the time spring arrived, every single farmer who had mocked that girl would find himself standing at the edge of her tree line, hat in hand, wishing he had done the same. Clara Voss didn't talk much. She never had. Her parents had died of influenza when she was 6, and she'd been raised since by her grandparents, Ezra and Mabel Voss, on a modest dairy and grain farm 3 miles outside town. It wasn't a large operation, 40 acres, a dozen milk cows, a few hogs, and fields of wheat and oats that fed the family more than the market. But it was theirs, and it had been theirs since Ezra's own father cleared the land with an ox team back in 1889. Where other children chattered and ran wild through the schoolyard, Clara watched. She noticed things other people walked right past. She noticed which way the smoke from the chimney bent before a storm rolled in. She noticed how the cattle bunched together tight in the corner of the pasture 2 days before a cold snap, long before anyone else felt a change in the air. She noticed the geese, how their migration that autumn came earlier than usual and in tighter, more urgent formations than Ezra had seen in years. "She's got an old soul," Mabel used to say, watching her granddaughter sit for an hour at the edge of the porch, just listening to the wind move through the empty fields. Clara had one constant companion, a scruffy brown and white farm dog named Scout, who'd shown up as a stray pup 2 winters back and never left her side since. Scout followed her to the barn every morning, sat beside her while she did her chores, and curled up against her legs each night by the wood stove. Where Clara went, Scout went. It was as simple as that. It was Ezra who had shaped so much of how Clara saw the world, though by the autumn of 1936, he was gone. He'd passed the previous winter, quietly, in his sleep, after a lifetime of hard seasons on that same patch of earth. But before he died, he'd left Clara something most people in the valley didn't know about: an old, worn agricultural handbook, its pages soft with handling, tucked inside a tin box in the tool shed. Clara had read it a dozen times that year, cover to cover by lamplight, long after Mabel had gone to bed. She never told anyone what was in it. If you are enjoying this story, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and also comment where you are watching from. Now back to Clara. When Clara began digging that first row of holes along the north side of the barn, nobody thought much of it. Children played. Children built things. It seemed harmless enough. But as the weeks went on and the rows kept growing north side, then west, then curling around toward the east, people started to talk. She worked with a method that seemed almost too deliberate for a child. She paced out the spacing herself, roughly 8 feet between each seedling, staggering the rows rather than lining them up straight. She dug each hole deep and wide, working the clay-heavy soil loose with a spade nearly as tall as she was. She'd drop in a handful of composted manure from the barn, settle the seedling's roots gently, then pack the earth back around it with her bare hands. Every seedling got water, even when it meant hauling buckets from the well 100 yards away, back and forth, morning after morning, her arms trembling with the weight by the 10th trip. Scout trotted beside her the whole time, sniffing at the fresh turned dirt, lying down in the shade of the water bucket while she worked. The neighbors who passed by on the county road slowed their wagons to watch. "Looks nice, Clara," said Mrs. Holt from the next farm over, not unkindly. "Real pretty around the old barn." "You'd get more use out of that time fixing your grandmother's hen house," said old Mr. Dietrich, who farmed the section just south of the Voss place, and had never planted a tree in his life. He didn't intend to cut down for lumber. "Those pines won't feed a single cow," another farmer added, chuckling as he rode past. Clara never argued. She never explained herself either. She'd just glance up, offer a small, quiet smile, and go back to digging. The not knowing was almost unbearable for some of the grown men in that valley, men who prided themselves on understanding every inch of farm work there was to understand, standing there baffled by a 10-year-old girl and her rows of scrawny little trees. Mabel, for her part, never once told Clara to stop. She'd watch from the porch some evenings, arms crossed against the chill, saying nothing. She trusted her granddaughter's quiet. She always had. It wasn't easy going that first year. A dry August scorched the valley, and Clara lost nearly 30 seedlings to the heat before she thought to mulch around their bases with old straw to hold in what moisture there was. Deer came through one September night and stripped the needles clean off an entire row along the western edge, nearly 20 trees, gnawed down to bare, sad little stems by morning. Clara stood at the fence line the next day, jaw tight, staring at the damage. She didn't cry. She went to the shed, gathered more seedlings, and replanted every single one. A windstorm in early October snapped 6 young pines clean in half. She replanted those too. Word got around town about the girl who wouldn't quit, and the mockery softened into something more like bewilderment. A few of the older women started bringing her seedlings of their own, extras from their gardens, though even they couldn't say why they were helping with something they didn't understand. "She's stubborn as her grandfather," Mabel would say, and there was pride buried somewhere under the worry in her voice. That autumn, something in the valley felt different, though nobody could quite name it. The geese left nearly 3 weeks earlier than usual, flying low and fast in tight V formations, as though they were running from something. The squirrels seemed frantic, bearing acorns at a pace old Mr. Dietrich said he hadn't seen since before the last bad one a winter he wouldn't name, but everyone over 50 in that valley remembered anyway. The cattle grew thick, shaggy coats earlier than normal, and Ezra's old barn cat, a half-wild tom named Whiskey, refused to leave the hayloft at all by the second week of November. Amos Whitfield, the oldest man in Ashwood Valley, pushing 90, with a face like a dried apple, and a memory that stretched back to blizzards most folks had only heard about in stories, sat on a bench outside the general store one gray afternoon and said, to no one in particular, "This winter won't forgive mistakes." Nobody asked him what he meant. They would understand soon enough. It came in late January, and it came without much warning, a wall of gray-white sky rolling in from the northwest, swallowing the horizon whole. The wind hit first. It came screaming across the open fields at speeds no one in the valley had a number for, tearing loose shingles, splintering fence rails, flattening a grain bin 2 farms over as though it were made of paper instead of tin. Within an hour, visibility dropped to nothing. Snow didn't fall so much as it was hurled sideways, thick and blinding, stinging any exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Temperatures plunged to nearly 30 below, with wind chill driving it far colder than any thermometer could properly measure. Across the valley, farms that had stood exposed and unprotected for generations were caught in the full, unbroken force of it. At the Dietrich place, snow piled so high against the barn's north wall that it buried the lower windows entirely, and the wind found every gap in the old boards, driving cold straight into the stalls where the livestock huddled and shivered through the night. At the Holt farm, a water trough froze solid within hours, and the family spent the worst part of the storm breaking ice by lantern light, fingers numb, faces raw from the wind that came screaming unbroken across their open yard. Fences collapsed under the weight of drifted snow, barn doors, jammed shut by ice and wind-packed drifts, had to be shoveled out by desperate men working blind in the whiteout, praying their animals hadn't frozen before they could reach them. It was, by every account later given, the worst storm the valley had seen in over 40 years. And then there was the Voss farm. The wind that tore across every open field in Ashwood Valley met something different when it reached Clara's barn. It met 200 pine trees, now grown tall and dense enough after that first hard year of struggle to do exactly what her grandfather's old handbook had promised they would. The trees didn't stop the wind. Nothing stops wind like that. But they broke it, slowed it, scattered it, forced it up and over instead of driving it straight into the barn walls at full brutal force. The snow that would have piled against the barn instead caught in the branches and gathered in soft, deep drifts along the tree line itself, a full 30 yards out from the building. Inside, the animals stood calm in their stalls, huddled but steady, sheltered from the worst of the roaring wind outside. The barn's temperature, while still bitterly cold, never dropped to the dangerous extremes that threatened livestock on farms, left fully exposed. The water trough, tucked close against the sheltered south wall, iced over but didn't freeze solid. The barn doors, protected from the worst of the drifting snow, never jammed shut. Clara and Mabel made it through the night without losing a single animal. It was everything Ezra's handbook had described, laid bare in the worst possible test. Pine windbreaks slow the wind before it ever reaches a structure. They trap drifting snow at a distance rather than letting it pile against walls and doors. They reduce the brutal heat loss that comes from unbroken wind hammering a barn's exposed sides. They protect livestock not through magic, but through simple, patient physics, the kind an old farmer had known, and had made sure his granddaughter knew too, long before the storm ever arrived to prove it. By the time the blizzard finally broke, 3 days later, word had already begun to spread about the Voss farm, the one place in the valley that had come through nearly untouched. They came in the days after, one by one, walking or riding through the snow-choked roads to see it for themselves. Old Mr. Dietrich, who'd lost 2 calves in the storm and spent 2 full days digging his barn free of drifted snow, stood at the edge of Clara's tree line for a long while, saying nothing. Finally, he took off his hat. "I was wrong," he said quietly. It wasn't easy for a man like that to say, but he said it. Clara, standing beside Scout with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, just nodded. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. There were no speeches, no triumphant declarations. Clara didn't gloat, and she never once said, "I told you so," mostly because she never had told them so in the first place. She'd simply done the work, quietly, while everyone else waited to understand. That spring, something shifted in Ashwood Valley. Farmers who had once laughed at a young girl's rows of pine trees began digging holes of their own. Seedlings were ordered from the county nursery in numbers nobody had ever seen before. Windbreaks went up around barns, farmhouses, and feedlots across the valley, planted by men who, 6 months earlier, wouldn't have known a pine windbreak from a decoration. It became known in later years simply as Clara's lesson passed down through the valley, the way old farming wisdom always is, quietly, from one generation's hard-won experience to the next. There's an old kind of wisdom in farming that doesn't shout. It doesn't need to convince anyone right away. It just waits, patiently, for the season that proves it right. Clara Voss didn't plant those trees to prove a point. She planted them because her grandfather had taught her to see further ahead than the people around her, to notice the wind, the birds, the signs the land was already giving, long before disaster arrived to make believers out of everyone else. It's a lesson that reaches far beyond one Minnesota farm in 1936. Sometimes the quiet work nobody understands is the only thing standing between you and the storm nobody saw coming. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next forgotten piece of American farming history. There are more stories like Clara's waiting to be told, and new ones going up regularly. If you've ever had a moment where people doubted you before you were proven right, share it in the comments below. Stories like Clara's remind us that patience and quiet wisdom often win out in the end, and yours might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.